with the success of Barbarian Days, I don't have to lie so much.
Uh-huh.
I can say, I'm going to actually be surfing tomorrow, and then I'll do, what we talked about. And they don't say, what? So, like, that's unacceptable. So, oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, surfing, that's important.
Are you ready, boys? Start swimming.
That's William Finnegan. I'm Jamie Brisick, and this is Soundings, brought to you by the Surface Journal. The Journal is a member-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from FCS, Finisterre, Howler Brothers, Patagonia, Rainbow, Vans, and Yeti. More like a book than a magazine, the Journal delivers 136 pages of independent storytelling every 8 weeks, covering the people, culture, travel, and art of surfing. If you want to learn more, if you'd like to subscribe, please visit surfacejournal.com. William was born in 1952 in New York City and moved with his family as an infant to Los Angeles. He spent most of his childhood and teenage years in Southern California, but enjoyed occasional spells living with his family in Honolulu, Hawaii, where his father worked as a film producer. He learned to surf in California at age 10. After earning a BA from UC Santa Cruz in 1974, Finnegan worked a string of jobs: bookstore clerk, railroad brakeman, dishwasher, bartender, English teacher. Made extended surf sojourns, Australia, Fiji, Indonesia, South Africa, and took an MFA in creative writing from the University of Montana. Finnegan has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1987. His debut book, Crossing the Line, A Year in the Land of Apartheid, was listed by the New York Times as one of the 10 best nonfiction books of 1986. He's reported from war-ravaged Somalia, Sudan, Yugoslavia, Mozambique, and El Salvador, and examined from close range the Mexican drug trade. Playing Doc's Games, his two-part essay, which featured in The New Yorker in 1992, was widely considered the finest piece of surf writing ever produced. But it was outdone by Bill himself when he wrote his memoir, Barbarian Days, which won the Pulitzer Prize for biography and autobiography in 2016. William and I, or Bill as his friends call him, spoke at his office in New York's Central Park West. Bill, welcome to the show.
Really glad to be here, Jamie.
So you and I met, I want to say it was roughly 2010. At the time, your Playing Doc's Games had been out for quite some time in The New Yorker, and it was kind of this gold standard of surf writing. And you were working on the memoir that would become Barbarian Days. You and I were having dinner from, sporadically every couple of months, 3 months or what have you, over a couple of years before the book actually came out. And I distinctly remember asking you how the book's going and you saying, it's a disaster. It's never going to work. It was very, very much not what you might expect to hear from someone working in progress to what would become a Pulitzer Prize winning memoir.
I'm actually really glad to hear this. I don't remember. You block these things out. You suffer through them, and I know that book took me forever to write, and I kept putting it down and going back to journalism and my job, and then would work some more on it. I don't remember the long phase. It may have been years and years during which I felt like it was a disaster and would never be finished. But it's good because of what I'm working on right now is a disaster that will never be finished. To hear that for a while that was true of Barbarian Days too. I remember in that period when we first knew each other, you interviewed me for Surfer's Journal.
Yes.
And in this very room.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I think I'd ever said anything publicly about this memoir I was working on. Mm-hmm. We'd talked about it, so you knew, and so you asked. And I kind of, bit my tongue and went back and forth and finally just talked about it. Mm-hmm. It's this, it's that. And gave you guys a couple of photos from,
yep.
Stuff I was writing about in Australia and wherever. And it really felt like, oh, now I've committed myself. It's going to be in print that I'm going to write this damn thing. So it was actually a big step for me.
Is the process of writing long form or even journalism, say for the New Yorker, is it always tough?
Well, for me it is, tougher sometimes than others. And maybe it's a mischaracterization to describe what I do as journalism, because I've never done news. I've never done hard news. And I write about politics a lot, always have, for the magazine. But it's usually long form. I mean, I write columns that are like for this week or for the website, for today. But mostly I write long form stuff that goes under various names, literary journalism, whatever, literary nonfiction. And so it's not strictly speaking journalism.
Yeah.
But it is all, the facts, and often is about, events of the day. And I used to do a lot of conflict reporting, so it'd be very immediate, like this war is happening, and here's what it's like, here's what it means, insofar as I can determine that. But it wasn't like I had a day job at a newspaper. So mostly I'm working on long pieces. Sometimes they'll take a year or more, or hopefully less. And they're often out of focus for long periods while I'm working on them. And although Barbarian Days is a completely different thing as a memoir, reporting long form pieces has also often been a kind of whiplash experience for me. I mean, I usually go into them with a bunch of preconceptions. These guys are fighting those guys, and they're backed by this, and they represent that, and here's what this war is. Or this, just to take one example, and then I actually really don't know what I'm going to find. And I very often find something completely different from what I expected, not just in conflict reporting, but in all kinds of pieces I've done. I mean, the villain of the story, as I had pitched it to my editors, turns out over a long, sort of traumatic for me experience process to be the hero, and trying to get my head around that and understand what's really going on is often sort of the story I end up telling. Yeah. Depending on how much that really supplies the tension of the story. But so there's all the struggling to understand as you report.
Sure.
And then there's the struggling to write. Separate things, really, for me.
Yeah, I like the expression "out of focus," and I think that is very accurate in terms of seeing something that you're not quite what it is, and you're sort of discovering as you research, report, etc. I remember in my early 20s reading, I want to say it was an interview with the writer Paul Theroux, who we both know, I think, and he said something like, writing is an education in the eyes of the public. And I remember thinking that it was so romantic to me, this idea that you could sort of follow curiosities and somehow get paid to do it, and writing be the vehicle, through which you would share. At what point did you become serious about writing, knowing you wanted to be a writer?
Well, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I wrote stories and kept journals from a very young age, and was primarily, I was a poet, and then I was a fiction writer, but was never really making any money at it, and wasn't really in a kind of relationship with my readers or hoped for readers that was particularly realistic or healthy. I was, immature, and eventually I turned to nonfiction. That was kind of happened quickly in my late 20s. I was working odd jobs and traveling, and I had a job teaching in a high school outside Cape Town. This is in the bad old days of apartheid. And I was really stuck into this world and of resistance to apartheid from the township where I was working. And that just grabbed me and kind of changed my orientation. And by the end of that year, all I really wanted to do was write about power and politics and social justice, and became a journalist through that. And then I was freelancing at first, and as you go from like magazine to magazine, you have to think about who the readers of this thing are, who the readers of that thing are. And eventually I settled on the New Yorker and had a strong idea of who my readers were. or a sort of developing idea of that, and developing a relationship with them. And so I was always going to be a writer, but I only sort of became somebody who wrote for publication and felt like I had something going on with people who read my stuff when I was probably in my 30s.
In Barbarian Days and Playing Ducks Games, you kind of write about surfing being this one thing that you love and you're deeply immersed in, and then also writing for The New Yorker and a different life, living in a place that's maybe not so much about not chasing surf, not putting that at the front of things. You traveled a whole lot. Do you feel like, and a lot of the travel was driven by surfing, do you feel like that was this sort of education that led you to the writing that you would eventually do?
In some ways, yeah. I mean, I didn't. I traveled for other reasons besides surfing. When I was young, I really had the sort of itch and was constantly hitchhiking here and there, and was in Europe a few times for reasons other than surfing. Although if I ever got near a surf spot, I'd find a way to get in the water. But yeah, there was a long trip I made, which I wrote about in Barbarian Days, in my sort of mid to late 20s. Few years overseas, where I really sort of sank in deep to the places where we were in the South Pacific and Indonesia and Australia, ultimately South Africa. And that, yeah, I was already, before I had turned to writing for publication, freelancing from overseas, I was already kind of reporting, spending a lot of time just deposing people, like, tell me more, some farmer in Indonesia, I just want to know everything.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I went there for the waves, but I ended up, really interested in the place and kind of becoming a reporter without knowing that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thinking about a lot of the writing you've done for The New Yorker, reporting you've done for the New Yorker profiles, etc., they've been about someone other than yourself. Barbarian Days, you were, it was in the first person. Was that a strange, difficult switch for you?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was kind of a pleasure to plunge back into my past, my family's past, and try to put it together in a coherent way, and make sense of it for myself. But it was also sort of hard to stick with that. Okay, this is about me, rather than like meet somebody interesting and veer off 90 degrees and write about their family and their history and and I did that repeatedly, and my editor would say, why are we reading about this, Indonesian family? Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, because it's easier. Because I've learned all this stuff and I'm not emotionally invested in the same way I am in my own memories and my close friends and loved ones, and it's easier. So it on the one hand is you don't have to work at it in the same way you do with reporting, but writing about oneself and sort of being fair, and deciding what, since this is all private life, right? And by then I was a full-blown, journalist or writer of nonfiction, and then to suddenly write about private life, where nothing was on the record, where, it's all these shared experiences with friends and loved ones that you're now arrogating to yourself the right to put it in print. You really have to think hard about what you can use and what you shouldn't, and then check with people and debate and argue about what actually happened, and decide what you have a right to. 'Cause everybody sort of has some rights over their own story.
Yes.
And do I have the right to tell this? And in some cases I would decide no, it's a great story, but it's really hers, not mine. Mm-hmm. So there were a lot of sort of tensions around that shift, and it's one of the reasons it took me so long to write the book, because I would, on the one hand, think, who cares? I'm writing about my life, writing about surfing. These are not exactly, earth-shaking subjects. And meanwhile, I'm writing about big political conflicts, or I was doing a lot of international reporting in those days, and focusing on, humanitarian crises or things that seemed important, self-evidently important. So it was hard to sort of stick with, feel justified in sticking with this memoir. Oh, and then I did this, and I met this person, and so the back and forth was time consuming, and it was hard to stick with the memoir for long periods of time.
A lot of memoir and personal essay is associated with the C word being cathartic. And I won't ask if it was cathartic for you, but was there self-discovery? Did it make sense of that period of your life by revisiting it and then mining through it and polishing and?
Yeah. In some true ways, yes. Also in some artificial ways. I mean, you decide how to structure it as a story, leaving out whole big parts that might be important, but for whatever reason you decide don't work or aren't right to be in there. So I wouldn't call it a fairy tale, but it's got this quality of sort of artificial framing and selection.
Yeah.
That make your life seem neater than in fact it was.
Yeah.
But also, yeah, kind of ordering things and deciding what was most important and maybe fondly remembering someone or a period that was clouded by the way it ended, that kind of thing. Was cathartic wouldn't be the right word, but kind of satisfying. And I don't remember any real crises in the writing of it, besides all these sort of debates and struggles with old friends or frenemies, whomever, over what to put in. But it wasn't the kind of thing where, oh, I thought it all meant this, but it doesn't. It means the opposite. I didn't really have that with Barbarian Days.
Yeah. What was the funnest part of writing it?
Probably my journals weren't as good as I hoped they would be as I went back through them. They were sort of self-involved in a way that I wish they weren't. I mean, I wish they had more description of what was around me and what people said. But still, the kind of immersion in a period, in a place, whether from my youth or more recently, could be just, couldn't call it pure pleasure, but really take me out of myself, and I would just be there for whole periods of time, and it wasn't like it was work. I wasn't having to go out and report and get this story. I already had this story.
Yeah.
And so that made some parts of it really sweet.
Yeah. One of my favorite passages is the part where you're surfing out at what we now call restaurants, and the reef is so transparent you can barely see water above the reef itself. And I love that because I've surfed there and I've had that sort of experience myself to some extent. But most of all, I love it because as someone who writes about surfing and being in the water and riding a wave, it is so difficult to strike the right note of not going purple or flowery or over-describing, making it like a bad sex scene, let's say, and just finding, just enough to make it vivid and alive for the reader, but not romanticizing or...
Yeah. Well, it's completely different, of course, to write about surfing for a general audience who knows, basically, they know nothing about surfing, and to write about surfing for surfers, which I've hardly ever done, if ever. I guess I wrote a few pieces for tracks. I wrote one thing for surfers, so those would be the exceptions. But otherwise, like Barbarian Days, you mentioned Playing Doc's Games. Those are for general readers. You have to introduce surfing terms, with clunky definitions. And so it's, I sort of have to step outside my world, in which I know a lot of surfers, and we talk about surfing in a certain way, and find a different way to talk about it. That little scene you described, that wasn't really a surf thing. It was the water that became super transparent when the sort of tide was slack, the wind completely quit midday, and it's shallow already, the water's clear already, and suddenly you just can't tell if it's 2 feet deep or 10, and then little waves are coming. It was a small day, and you could actually see through them, as they're coming toward you, I mean, there's an island across the way, Malolo, and you can see Malolo through the wave. And then as you take off, it was small enough that you just couldn't see it at all. And it wasn't like standing up against the horizon. It was just, there was just water, and you could feel it. It's moving fast, okay, and I'm taking off, and now I'm going. But unless you sort of crouched down and caught the angle, you literally couldn't see the wave. All you could see was reef, and you're just sort of flying across this shallow reef. And that was, I mean, a surfer could picture it, and a non-surfer could too. It wasn't a particularly surfy scene.
Yes. Yep. Where does surfing fit into your life now?
Well, still chasing waves. I think it's going to be good tomorrow. Locally, we're in New York. There's a nice little fall swell coming tonight, and the wind should be right in the morning. So still surfing, but worse and worse all the time. It's terrible as you get old. I've been surfing a lot this year. I've been in Indonesia a couple of times, and for reporting ostensibly, but really mostly surfing. If the waves are good, very little reporting gets done. And so I'm sort of hanging on to it. I also do a lot of rock climbing these days. My daughter got into that a few years ago, and I followed her into it. And it's sort of less fickle. The rock is more often good than the surf is around here. So I do have other sort of outlets that get me outdoors and into stuff I want to do. But surfing's still my first thought about where to be and when and how to organize the rest of my life around it, which has been the issue I've been in New York for a long time, and didn't really know about the waves around here too much in the first years, but slowly realized that there's good surf, Long Island and New Jersey mainly, and found friends to surf with, and it's become more and more of a don't miss a good day, and so you have to tell some lies to your editors and whatever so that you're ready. Although nowadays, with the success of Barbarian Days, I don't have to lie so much. I can say, I'm going to actually be surfing tomorrow, and then I'll do, what we talked about. And they don't say, what? So, that's unacceptable. So, oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, surfing, that's important.
It's so interesting because I remember you and I having talking more than 10 years ago, and you, I want to say you used I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of I didn't want to be outed as a sort of Spicoli when you were making your way. Your surfing was almost this thing kept closeted to some extent. And then interestingly, like Barbarian Days, it's almost as if you wrote the book that would legitimize the very thing that you do. And we're sitting in, Central Park West right now. We're surrounded by books. Your colleagues at the New Yorker are all celebrated public intellectuals who we all know. And there was a time where maybe surfing would have been at odds with the kind of intellectual rigor that you are undertaking, but now it doesn't seem that disparate, I guess. Like you and to some extent, I feel like you've contributed on a large scale to actually making that thing. The demographics of surfing have shifted so much, and we don't think of surfers as dudes who open up their van door and a cloud of marijuana smoke flutters up into the air. Although I do see a lot of that in Malibu, but
see a lot of that everywhere.
Yeah, but I think I could see David Remnick from the New Yorker saying, "Yeah, Bill, how was the surf over the weekend? I read that there was a swell." I mean, it wouldn't have been like that 30 years ago.
No. The real sort of crunch with the question you talked about, should I out myself as a surfer? Because I was writing a lot about politics, a lot about policy, U.S. foreign policy in South Africa or Central America or whatever, engaged in these policy debates publicly through the pages of the New Yorker. It was really with the publication of Playing Doc's Games, which was in '92, a long time ago.
Yeah.
But I got that assignment in the mid-'80s. It took like 7 years to write it. And one of my hesitations was because I was doing this other kind of work, do I want to out myself as a surfer? Or are some of these policy geeks I'm arguing with going to say, oh, what? You're just a dumb surfer. We don't need to take you seriously. And ultimately, I finished the piece and it ran, and nobody ever said that. It turned out it was a non-issue, but that's when I really worried about it. And because it seemed like an odd thing to do, and that was a big project. It was a 2-part piece.
Yeah.
It took me years to write, and it was my first effort at writing about surfing, and it was definitely for non-surfers. So like how to do it, and I was more or less happy with how it came out, and it was sort of well received. It led. I mean, my publisher now was interested in me writing about surfing, and she wanted actually to bring that out as a book. It was that long a piece, but I said, nah, it's not. That's not a book, and slowly committed myself to this memoir, which is like my whole life of surfing up till now. So by the time Barbarian Days came out, I wasn't worried about that anymore. It hadn't stopped me before or troubled me particularly. But it's true that Barbarian Days had a sort of wider impact, and made it a little more, I don't know, intellectually respectable, perhaps, to surf. Although, as we both know, for lack of a better phrase, hardcore surfing is not something that, this is sort of controversial. People get mad at me about this because I've said it and written it, that it's really hard to learn to surf as an adult. So people who decide that surfing is something they want to do, they have the leisure time, whatever, but they're not kids, struggle on the edges of it, and probably never enter into the version of surfing that you and I know and that we grew up with. So it's sort of intellectually respectable, but there's lots of kind of flammery around the edges of that.
Yes.
Like, I surf. Since when? Since, my wife and I took a lesson in Costa Rica last summer. Oh, okay. And you and I know how that goes. But it's true that I don't have to apologize for the fact that I surf anymore at work.
Yeah. I think a lot of things have changed that. I mean, I think when I was growing up and you as well, there wasn't surf forecasting wasn't really a thing. It wasn't, surgically accurate to the extent that it is today. Tomorrow that like you want to make the day free because there's going to be waves. It used to be a little bit more of just a crapshoot. If you had some time, you'd go. And I sometimes think, that really affected the people's life choices, because if you were a hardcore surfer, you were not going to stray too far from being in view of the ocean. You don't want to miss that good day. And now that we have surf forecasting to the extent that we do, and with the lead time that it has, I mean, you can have a professional life and you can still hit the good days. And I think that's definitely contributed to that shift.
I agree. I don't know how one could. I mean, I live in Manhattan, and by the time I started surfing a lot from here, I guess in the 90s, there was decent surf forecasting, getting to be surf cams and all that. I just don't know how we would have done it.
Yeah.
We make these, it's fickle enough around here, and the windows are small enough that it's really, I mean, if you see it good on the cams locally, you've probably already missed it. By the time you get there, it'll be blown out, or the window will swung around or something. And I don't know how we would have done it in the pre-forecast. I mean, just running to the beach, it takes an hour or two, get organized and get out of here, the traffic, and then find nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are you writing now that you're excited about?
Right now, I'm trying to write about a couple different parts of Indonesia, and I think it's pretty interesting stuff. It's hard for me to tell. I'm so sort of deep in it. I was just in Bali, but I was primarily there to see surfers who had immigrated from Nias in the far northwest off Sumatra, and because that's a place I first went to in the 70s and have been back to, and it's completely changed, and a lot of hot young surfers come from there because the waves are so good, and they tend to head to Bali, the sort of bright lights. They want to be pro surfers, and what becomes of them. So I was sort of in Bali to see those guys and see what, and a lot of them end up teaching in surf schools, and the plan is to compete and be a pro surfer, but rarely works out. And so it's very deep inside surfing, but at the same time, it's a story about, village life in Indonesia and what's become of Bali, this crazy sort of dystopian tourist destination. And I've seen Bali over the years since the 70s. And so it's about the changes in those places. And none of this would be news to surfers, but this, again, is for our general audience. And so how to make all this matter and make sense. I don't know if I'm succeeding, but that's what I'm working on at the moment.
How is traveling, now as opposed to, say, in the 70s? How is the experience different? Obviously, you've seen changes in the places that you visit, but does the travel itself feel different? I mean, it's so much more common, I think. You and I have talked about this in the past, and I think, you'd mentioned something to the effect that it was this sort of badge of honor when you were younger. It was this something you felt that you had to go out and do, and it was part of educating yourself. Whereas now and part of this is maybe social media influence, but I look on social media and everyone's in exotic places all the time.
Yeah.
Or maybe not exotic, but there's a sort of self-congratulatory thing. It might be the Amalfi Coast, but it's, they're jumping on airplanes.
Yeah, it's changed, sort of fundamentally. And the grooves are much deeper. People arriving en masse. And Nias, for instance, is quite crowded now. The wave itself has changed. A sort of village grew up where there was none on the point there at Sorake and Lagundri Bay. And it's radically different. We went out there on a kind of rumor in the late 70s and took a little leaky boat from Sumatra out there, and it was all kind of sketchy in 19th century almost, and that's completely different, obviously. You get there and there's good Wi-Fi. It just, and yet it's still poor. Public health is still in pretty bad shape, and the adaptation in local culture. Just that corner of Nias to this influx of surf tourism, basically. A few other people, but basically it's foreign surfers, is all very interesting. But the place itself has not really changed that much. So it's different in different places. You no longer, at least I no longer, turn up somewhere where people have never seen a surfboard. Mm-hmm. They don't understand what you plan to do with it. They don't even believe it's possible to ride a wave on that thing. That's all obviously long past. And the sort of dissemination of surfing itself, surf culture, surf imagery, is so extensive. Mm-hmm. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. When you make an effort to measure what was and then what became. And this proliferation of surf schools. Yeah. I mentioned these guys end up teaching in surf schools. There are just so many of them. Mm-hmm. Portugal, Costa Rica, Bali, anywhere you go, there's just surf schools forever. And what are those? And mm-hmm. does anybody go to surf school and learn to surf and become a serious or competent surfer? I don't know. I kind of doubt it from what I've seen. It's got a sort of different function. Yeah. You're pushing people into waves, basically. But that's all. So you come to places, if you're traveling to surf, and it's already there. You're very unlikely to be sort of pioneering anything. Mm-hmm. And unless you get far enough off the beaten track, you go up the west coast of Africa, you're likely to find something that's either not been surfed before or certainly not much and nobody knows about. But I think it's harder than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that people are less, I think pre-internet and pre-smartphone, there was, when you traveled to especially like far-flung places, you were cut off from your ability to sort of phone home to the family was not as easy, and there was maybe a deeper immersion, I guess. You were more in that actual place, whereas now I think I see a thing where people travel, but then they're posting pictures on their social media feed all day long, and then looking at their heads in the screen probably as much as it's in the new place, the quote unquote new place that they're supposed to be experiencing. Is that something that you've observed?
Oh yeah, you've described it well. I'm not on social media myself, so I'm not participating, but I do see it all around me, and I don't know, it's easy to romanticize this sort of pre-internet past, and one sort of took for granted the privations. Didn't think, oh, this is terrible, I can't phone home, but it's true, you surely couldn't, and it was possible to get to town and make a phone call, I'm sure, but we were traveling, on the cheap, and phone calls weren't cheap, and so I would phone home, I don't know, maybe once a year, at Christmas or something, and there were letters and post restant. But I remember a stretch when, I found out that my grandmother had died 3 months after she died, because that's how long it was between general delivery letters, and which was terrible, but also felt. At the time think this is outrageous. I just thought this is how life is. This is how it goes.
Yeah.
So it looking back, it seems to be so out of touch.
Yeah.
Just basically unreachable for long periods. Didn't seem weird then. It only seems weird now. And so it's not like that was great. It just is what it was.
Yeah.
Or was what it was. And I don't. No, I'm happy to get good Wi-Fi when I land up somewhere, and I've gotten this. I may not be posting on Instagram every day, but I am eager to hear from my friends and family. So
yeah, why are you not on social media?
Well, I do see. Most people I know, I guess, are, and I do see this kind of obsession with self-representation and a kind of documentation, but that's not particularly edifying to me. I don't even. I have to report on Instagram, for instance, plenty if I'm writing about people whose heads and whose lives are partly lived on Instagram or wherever. So it's not that I never am there, but I'm just lurking. I'm not posting, and I see how consuming it can be.
Yeah.
Some people, I think, use it very sort of productively or constructively, and it doesn't drive them crazy. But I, for instance, a few years ago, I was writing about a kind of mysterious mass shooting in California, and I say mysterious because the motives and what actually happened was not at all clear, and I was reporting, talking to the people, survivors, and witnesses, and so on, and then I kind of at one point fell through into I guess it was all Facebook then, but there was this kind of war going on, this sort of religious fundamentalist, screaming match between people who worked in this government agency in San Bernardino. And one of them picked up a gun, his wife, and killed the other one and a bunch of their coworkers. And it wasn't the only explanation for what was going on, but it was a big part of it. And these people were, being polite at work, I guess, but they were in this incredible, as I say, sort of fundamental screaming match that was part of the story. And so it's I have to keep my eye on it, but I don't want to live through it if I can avoid it.
Yeah. It's I participate. I also sort of observe from a distance, and it is very different. I think about going back to earlier that idea of sort of an curiosity and an education in the public's eye, as I quoted Paul through. But I to my mind, there's something so great about being interested in other people, and I think you and I share that. I know that when I met you, I was so, yourself and a lot of other writers whom I respect tremendously, when I've when I've met them or been, out to dinner, whatever, there's a thing of asking a lot of questions of other people. And sometimes I think in the social media has created this sort of landscape where it's about the self and it's about the branding, marketing of the self so much that it blocks that kind of curiosity to hear what someone else's story is.
Yeah, I'm not deep enough in it to say, but I certainly see what you mean. And there are plenty of people I want to keep track of or want to see what they've been up to, who live enough, including pro surfers, through social media and are obliged to post. I mean, they've got these sponsors that expect it. And if you want to find out, did he catch that swell in Namibia? What do you know? He did. I don't have to WhatsApp him. I can see that he was there.
No, that's an incredibly fun part, I must say. That to contradict everything I just said, I find myself, watching a wave that happened earlier that day and from some swell on the other side of the world, and it is exciting, and there's that like real time element. On that note, who are your favorite surfers?
The guy I was just thinking of when I said that, Mikey February from Cape Town, is one of my very favorite surfers. I got to see him surf a fair bit in, June, July in South Africa. There was actually a day, he's not competing anymore, but he rides all kinds of different boards, and he'll bring a bunch of boards to the beach, none of which is a conventional shortboard, and he'll switch off and perform magic in different genres. And I was at Jeffries with him just before the CT contest, but like all the main players showed up because the swell showed up a couple of days before the contest, and so I was watching him surf, but it's also John Florence and Ethan Ewing and Jack Robinson and who's that. I mean, it was the most, and it was crowded, and every single person out was an amazing surfer. And this is 8-foot J Bay, just absolutely roaring, beautiful waves, and a level that was so high. But Mikey's surfing still, really stood out. And it was different. I mean, he wasn't doing like standard contest, lip bashing, but he was doing a lot of amazing stuff, and he knows the wave really, really well, and was taking off in places where no one else would take off, and doing stuff no one else would do. So I mean, but among those top surfers, I mean, John Florence obviously, is still one of my favorite surfers to watch. Not just in those great high performance, right hand points, but in his home spots, pipeline and backdoor. Haleiwa, stuff he does is kind of in a league of its own, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I really love the carves in places where it's sort of over vertical and he's defying gravity as he kind of lays that outside rail in.
And in fact, he and his buddies, his brothers, surf these fierce little spots, log cabins, and along the beach, to the east of Pipeline, where, I mean, spots that terrify me. They break so hard, and there are rocks here and there kind of randomly. And you've surfed through all your life, you kind of maybe know where those rocks are. But he'll do some down carve that is just, you've never seen anything like it. And it's partly the confidence if I know what I'm doing, but also I know what this wave's going to do. And in a way that only a few people do.
It's really interesting watching that because and to some extent, maybe his results have reflected this as of late, but he seems to be surfing, I don't want to say in defiance, but it's not necessarily following what might score the most points, or he's maybe taking risks that, laying it on the line, literally and figuratively, in ways that that may not, be most fruitful in terms of the score that you want to get for that wave.
I see. You see, I mean, Ethan Ewing's a good contrast. Another incredible surfer. Who's right within the bounds of what he can do for the most part. Although he, I think it was at that J-Bay contest, he ran into Toledo in the final, maybe?
Yes, I think you're right.
And I mean, there was a point at which he was just outmatched by a much flashier surfer.
Yeah.
But in general, he's a great example of someone who gets the maximum points out of virtually every wave. Ewing, I think.
Yeah.
I sound like I'm a professional watcher of contests, which I really am not. But they catch my eye every now and then, and I waste hours at my computer.
No, I do too. They're really, really fun. But when you grew up, did you ever compete? Did you ever surf in contests?
No. Well, I take it back. I remember being in one little contest at Diamond Head when I was about maybe 13 or 14, and it's just kind of a locally organized thing. There was a lot of competition actually. This is the mid '60s in Hawaii, and it was pretty organized. And I wasn't really part of it, but I was around it, and some of my friends were in it, and I didn't realize how organized it was till later. I looked back, and there were standings, and there were all these little contests around. And this was just kind of a funky little one that I was in, and this kid, I came second, and the kid who beat me, I had never heard of, and who is this guy? And this was at my local spot. We called it Cliffs, Diamond Head Cliffs, and then we got to be friends. His name was Tommy Winkler. He lived at Tongs, another spot around the other side of Diamond Head, and he was really good. And he was kind of in that world. He was like one of the best surfers our age, and I knew a bunch of kids who competed a lot, but I did not know.
In the line of work, any great stories to tell? And I know that's very broad, but I know that you've reported on Somalia, you've reported on Mexican drug cartels. We'll put it in bro speak. Got any heavy stories?
No, I've never. I mean, yeah, I've had a few, sort of dramatic moments, days, experiences. I got arrested by the Serbian army, that kind of thing. But obviously, I survived all those. Nothing too terrible. I have had I have done a lot of reporting, not so much recently, where it's not like the end of the story, but where I felt like I was in the cockpit of violence and conflict in Mexico or the Balkans or in I would sort of specialized in covering civil wars for a number of years. Those were in Central America and Africa and the Balkans, and I had this similar experience at the end of reporting various of these pieces where I'd finally get out of, say, Somalia. I was there in the 90s covering the sort of post-intervention, the no government, the Somalia that people came to know or not really know because there was no more reporting from there. But like when I finally got out to Djibouti, the next door country, just there's these huge waves of relief, like perhaps literally kissing the ground once or twice in this situation, and shame because I'd been deeply involved in the place and in what people were doing and how they're surviving, and then I'm so relieved to be out of there, sort of thing. I've had that quite a few times. Even recently, relatively recently, I was in the high Andes in Peru in this gold mining town, writing about illegal gold mining or artisanal gold mining, as they wanted to call it. Really high. I mean, elevations over 18,000 feet, and very, very rough conditions. And this town of like 50,000 people with, among other things, no plumbing, if you can imagine that. And it was so cold that all the waste was frozen. But if they ever got a warm day, God knows what was going to happen. So I was in that place for a while, and in the mines a lot, dark and dreary and small and cold and wet and scary. And in the lives of people working there, and this was in 2015, and then finally I'm done, I've got it all, or I'm going to go down to a proper town down in, way further down in the Altiplano in Peru, to see a guy at the town he comes from, and getting a little minibus with a bunch of people and heading down. And when the first bits of greenery began to appear, or even just some grass, because it was just all rock and ice up there, and I don't know, I've been there a couple of weeks, but I just, and everybody suddenly became expansive, all these miners and the people who'd been up there for whatever reason, like going back to their towns and villages. And then we saw a horse in a field, and it was just like people were like cheering a horse. And I just felt incredibly emotional. It was like not coming out of a war, but just coming out of, a really, really tough place, back to the world. And in that case, it was just where things can grow. Because the ground is all poisoned with arsenic up there. And so, and that's a sort of, excuse me, sort of emblematic experience of a lot of my reporting. Just to get out of here. And sometimes those experiences have actually involved surfing, where I might be in a place that is grim, but I can like take a break and go surfing. I had this in Southern California once, where I was hanging around with a bunch of skinheads in the Antelope Valley, kind of northwest of LA. Sorry, northeast of LA. And these neo-Nazi white kids, and then they're sort of anti-racist skinheads gang battling. One kid was killed in the middle of my reporting, kids I knew. It was really grim. And every now and then I would just like keep an eye on what the surf was doing and take a break and run down to Malibu and surf. And it was just, like all my pores open, and I felt like I had been so lucky to grow up a bit closer to the coast and to have surfing and then take a day or something and then head back up into the Antelope Valley. So this doesn't just happen when you like escape Somalia or the Serbs kick you across the border into Croatia. It's on a much smaller scale too. And that's been a kind of, I won't say a defining experience, but it suggests what a lot of the reporting has been like for me, and this weird combination of kind of relief and happiness when you're done with the reporting, and shame to leave. Because you know what you're leaving people in. I've had that in Mexico, getting out of Michoacan, where I'd been reporting on organized crime for a while. And then after that, there's, of course, the problem of writing, but also the problem of endangering people you're writing about. That's been a pretty consistent theme. It's really, really strong in Mexico. You go and you interview people around a place that's where like organized crime has replaced the government, for instance, in parts of Michoacan. That's still true, I think. And so you have to be very, very careful who you talk to. But the fact is that just by showing up at their office or showing up at their house, and the neighbors, somebody sees you go in, you have endangered that person. And talking to a gringo, talking to a American magazine, whatever gets out or gets into people's heads, it can be so dangerous. And even if you take all the measures, you change people's names, you change details, they'll never figure out who this really was. In Michoacan, just is a good example, because there I thought I'd done everything I needed to do, and yet after that piece came out, a family that I had written about in this little town in a town where nobody speaks English. There was no way that anyone could be aware of the New Yorker. Somebody slipped a copy of the New Yorker under their door, like within days, and they had to go into hiding. And I was just completely, panicked, and trying to like bring them to America, or like but they had whole lives. These were, one was a school teacher, one was a lawyer. It was just not, and I felt like I'd ruined it. It was really, in the end, nothing terrible happened from that. But there's all that aspect to certain kinds of reporting, where your responsibility extends and extends, and you often can't use some of the best stuff you have because it's just too dangerous for the people you're writing about or the people who talk to you, even if you're not writing about them. So it's a kind of work that on the one hand you could say, oh, it was so dangerous and we got out alive, but that's a very kind of shallow approach to the work, because there's all the people who aren't getting out alive, who you're there to write about. And the peril, the crisis goes on and on.
Do you find, often the term is PTSD with regards to going, being in a war-torn places or what have you. I have friends who are Magnum photographers, and they go and get at the front lines, in the front lines, etc. But do you ever feel like there's a sort of, not a PTSD, but maybe a sort of residual effect where the kind of your levels of adrenaline rush raise, you need that, you become almost, I won't say addicted, but you want more of that because that level of stimulus, immersion?
For me, not really. That is to say, my projects are longer. I'm not a news reporter out there at the front. I've been around plenty of people who are war reporters, like career war reporters. Although it's generally thought of to be, a young person's game, and people do tend to get out of it if they can. But others are just in it over the long haul. Yeah, and it is very, very hard to have a life outside that that works and that's not kind of crazy. I know a couple of people who have done conflict reporting for many, many years, and they seem sane, but only a couple, and others are truly addicted to it, and you obviously get very cynical, and inevitably, I mean, if you take to heart every terrible thing you see, there'll be just nothing left of you. Yeah. And photographers, you mentioned Magnum photographers, have a far more dangerous job than print journalists. I mean, they have to, when the bullets start flying, they have to stand up, and we all like hide under our beds, like whatever we can get behind. Yeah. And the only journalist I saw get killed in while working was in El Salvador back during the Civil War, was of course a photographer. He stood up and caught a bullet, and so they sort of see the worst. I mean, their mantra is get closer, get closer. Yeah. And that's not true for print. I mean, you can interview people. You try and stay away from really life-threatening situations, but it's, as I say, it hasn't been a sort of a way of life for me, like day after day. This is what I do. Yeah. I file from the front. Yeah. It's never been like that. So not really. Yeah.
Who are your heroes, or who have been the big inspirations in your life?
Well, there's actually quite a tradition at the New Yorker of great sort of long-form nonfiction. People like John McPhee and Sandy Fraser, and Janet Malcolm, and before them, Jill Mitchell, A.J. Liebling, quite a few really good writers, some of whom work internationally, some just wrote about New York, and I've done actually a lot of writing about New York myself. We haven't talked about it, but those are the ones where you get to stay home and sleep in your own bed. Those are kind of nice too. And more generally, more broadly, I mean, people no longer with us, like George Orwell, did a lot of fantastic nonfiction, as well as the fiction for which he's better known. He kind of set the standard in a way for sort of honest political reporting. I don't know if you know his book, Homage to Catalonia.
I know it. I haven't read it.
Well, he went to cover the Spanish Civil War. Actually, he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He was part of the sort of brigades that organized socialists from around the world, especially the U.S. and Britain, to fight with the loyalists and the side that lost to Franco. So he went there with sort of a political agenda, but also just an honest eye, and able to write about the sort of brutalities and idiocy and corruption on his side. He was just set an amazingly high standard with that book, and The Road to Wigan Piers, another great book, Down and Out in Paris and London. He did a lot of great nonfiction reporting, as well as Animal Farm in 1984, and was one of the people who understood totalitarianism, I think, from the left better than anybody else. And it's a long list. And some people, kind of, like, did you ever read Dispatches, Michael Hare's book from Vietnam? Yeah. I think it really stands up. It's a sort of 60s book that you think, well, a lot of books from that period don't stand the test of time very well, but it really does. Yeah. And I don't really know what else he's done, but I really admire his work just for that book. I'll go back to that book and look at it. So it's a long list, and they're not all Americans and not all Brits, but great. And often they're novelists who, venture into long-form reporting, not hard-bitten journalists so much.
What about when you're not abroad reporting, traveling? When you're in New York City, what is a typical day like for you? How does it go?
Well, if I'm in a period of writing a piece that I've reported elsewhere, that's what I'm doing now. It's banging my head against the wall trying to get everything down as I remember it and as my notes reflect it in my interviews. And so that's one period. If I'm reporting locally, it's just kind of long days of dashing around trying to get people to talk to me. The last big piece I did a few months ago was about Penn Station, big railroad station here at Madison Square Garden, the sports arena that sits on top of it, and how the whole place is a travesty and what can be done and how it came to be like this and who the main players are and so on. So that's a kind of local reporting where you just spend a lot of time hanging around and trying to find people who really understand it and can talk about it well. And then, but it's also where I, at a certain point, kind of quit reporting and start writing. But it's easier to fill in. You can't phone somebody in Bosnia to tell you, you can, of course, but I mean, it's much easier to fill in. Like, oh, here's what I don't know, and I can go see this urbanist, and he can explain it to me. So there's that. The local reporting is one thing, and international reporting or kind of far-flung reporting is another. Do I have any downtime? Because after, like when a piece is going to press, then it's editing and fact-checking. And at the New Yorker in particular, closing a piece is a big production, and you feel like all the resources and the critical attention and support are focused on you for weeks sometimes. But the last days are always very intense, and then poof, there might be some follow up. Do an interview for the radio show or something, but in general, it's just like it's over, and you've got to kind of recover and go on to the next thing. But I don't know. I don't seem to get many breaks. I write columns still, quick political takes on things. But I write book reviews, things that are relatively sort of domestic and reasonable. All of columns are often with a very short deadline, and so you're crashing and might, pull all-nighters to get that done. So I don't feel like there's a normal. There's a bunch of different phases to the kind of work I do, and not a lot of time between work. I mean, I can't remember the last time I've not had a project.
Yeah, sure.
There are magazine pieces, and then there are books and book contracts things you've agreed to do, and you have to, whenever you're not doing something more immediate, that's what you should be doing. So it feels kind of chaotic, actually.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit, especially when the surf's good. We're in October now, and the best surf season of the year around is kind of finishing up now. But there are periods in September, October when I don't get a lot done because we're chasing waves around here.
Yeah. Do you ever think about retirement, or do you think you'll work right to the very end?
I don't know. A lot of friends and my brother and other people I know very well are retired, and I really envy them. I mean, I'm not sure what I'd do with myself. I'd probably go crazy, but they had jobs, or they saved money, or they're just, I'm not working anymore. And that sounds great, but I don't think it would probably work for me. I feel kind of useless.
Yes.
And I've seen a couple of old friends just this week who are retired and my age, older than me. I'm 70, and they seem to be really, at least one of them, really enjoying it. And she's got some gigs that she still does and make money, but kind of at her own pace, and seems to kind of run her own life in a way that I never feel like I run mine.
Mm-hmm.
And she highly recommends it, but I don't feel like I can afford it. And it doesn't seem to be for me, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm.
With surfing, I sometimes think I should quit, like after a bad day,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just doing everything wrong, or I'm on too long a board for this spot and whatever. I think I'm just gonna. But then I've had some really, really nice days lately too,
Mm-hmm.
where it helps me a lot to kind of lower my expectations.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I'm not going to go out and rip.
Yeah.
I'm not going to find the best peak and get the best wave. I'm just going to enjoy the waves I get.
Yeah.
And maybe move away from the crowd to a lesser peak. These are beach breaks around here.
Yes.
And just try to make a clean takeoff, a clean bottom turn, enjoy this, enjoy that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have a ball.
Yeah.
I really enjoy surfing alone now, where it's not,
Yes.
the pressure isn't like, oh, I could have surfed that wave better. It's just, no, what you can do. So I've reached that late phase of surfing, and when I do it right, it's really fun.
Mm-hmm. I recently did a podcast with Nat Young, and for whatever reason, just sort of naturally at the end, I said, Nat, it's a big existential question. What is the good life? And it's so broad and it's kind of ridiculous, but I want to ask you, what is the good life?
I'm in such turmoil usually, mostly about work, that I rarely reach those sort of plateaus of clarity where I think, this is the thing to be doing, or that was the thing to be doing, or it wasn't. And so I'm a little suspicious of the concept. That is, maybe I'm too addicted to the idea of struggling to do something good. But I have felt like in the work I do, if I'm not very self-critical, like really trying to force myself to do a better job, that I won't survive at it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been important. We have one child, daughter Molly, who's 20, almost 22, and don't see nearly enough of her. She's at college, away from New York, but times we get together with her, and it's she's about to come home for her birthday, and she and I go climbing, and I'm definitely not working.
Yeah.
I can sometimes think, well, how lucky we are. We're all healthy, and we have a bed to sleep in, which does not describe a lot of people in New York.
Sure.
And in the world generally, but really in your face, here. And I feel appreciated, perhaps, and love the people I'm with, and I think this is it.
Mm-hmm.
This, we did something right.
Very nice.
In fact, Caroline and I, my wife, often say, it's like, apropos of nothing, just like, our girl is the greatest. We made this girl. It's like, it's putting a little pressure on her, perhaps, but it's like, whatever else you think and struggle with, there's this glorious young person. And that's about the closest thing I can associate with that phrase, the good life.
I like this. No, that is the good life. Well, Bill, a pleasure, as always.
As always.
Thank you.
Sure. See you around, Jamie.
Okay. Soundings is produced by me, Jamie Brisick, and Jonathan Shiflett. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Our theme song is Give Me a Wave by Oscar Matsumiya and Pazlin Chanton. Soundings is brought to you by the Surfer's Journal, a reader-supported publication, made possible by sponsorship from FCS, Finisterre, Howler Brothers, Patagonia, Rainbow, Vans, and Yeti. The journal is published bi-monthly. If you haven't done so already, I encourage you to visit surfersjournal.com and subscribe. Thank you so much for listening to Soundings. We appreciate you, And until next time,